If you've been following the progress I've been making on repairing the Coots, you've probably seen the past video where I was saying that there was too much rotation in the rear tires on the Coot. There was play in the keyways of the stub axles on the rear hubs. Those rear hubs likely originated on a two-wheel steer unit older than the machine that they are currently on, as this machine is now being converted to four-wheel steering. And in order to do that, some old machine needed to have its front wheel steering installed on the back. That machine's front wheel steering are the round type stub axles, which are the earliest of the Coot axles. They eventually were upgraded to square-ended axles, which are much more resistant to braking, or not at all that I know of. The older single keyway stub axles were prone to wearing out and widening, and to the point where the key had enough slop that it would turn sideways and crack into the cast iron U-joints. So here you can see that this is what the one of the key slots look like in the round stub axle, and here is the opposite side of the cast iron U-joint where it's also been widened out, and a lot of the material has been worn away. There was so much play in these that it was really unacceptable, and they were just waiting to break. So I took those off the machine and began extracting the stub axles from the hub assembly. At first, I tried this automotive hub puller, but actually managed to strip out the threaded rod that goes in there. Sorry to my mechanic that I borrowed this from. I then moved on to putting two vices on a steel bar and clamping it that way. This also did not work. Finally, I just ended up using that compressive high lifter jack bar that I made to pull the worm gears out of my other Coot, and that worked, though I don't seem to have any photos or videos of that, sadly. The reason that I did not just put it in the hydraulic press was the assembly that this is mounted to, the kingpin and the steering joint assembly, is too wide to fit through the steel beams on the jack press, and it had to be done where I had more room to work around it. They were pulled out eventually on the first axle, stub axle. The second stub axle had a lot of damage on the castle nut from just banging into rocks and stuff over decades of use, and I had to go in on the vertical mill, drill out the pin, which I had broken on both ends trying to remove, and then end mill out and boring from both directions until there was no pin material left. When that was completed, I moved on to removing the castle nut, and that involved a humongous cheater bar because it was still on there so tight from how messed up the threads were underneath the castle nut, and I needed that cheater bar from the first stroke to the very last stroke. It was a very time-consuming process, and I went back to chase all those threads with a triangle file until I could rethread a castle nut back on. I ended up ruining both castle nuts, old castle nuts, in the process. They were ruined anyways. And I bought a third extra castle nut to chase the threads by threading it on in reverse and using the teeth of the castle nut as a makeshift thread die cutter. Once those were removed, oh, and it should be noted, before you remove them, you really have to remove all that material down that is worked up. It's sort of like a crater around where the key went in from all the metal peening out. And once that's filed, you can finally remove it from the hub, and then you have to remove those from the wheel hub. And when I said that backwards, the bearing hub, and then there's the wheel hub. I guess you call it the bearing carrier. So then I could get it into the hydraulic press and push those out, and it sounded like a gunshot when they came out there, and they're so tight. I would imagine you could take off the castle nuts and run this for the rest of its life, and they would never have fallen off. Moving on, we have everything disassembled, and I have both bearings out of the bearing housing, and I replaced those with new bearings and packed them with grease, and it takes a lot of grease. And then finally we have here, this was difficult to do with holding the camera and not being able to hold the U-joint. This is what the square surfaces. I should explain that I took the old stub axle and had them squared so that they could slide into new U-joints with a square opening, and that's what they look like going in there.
Putting the second coupe back together again. Just a note, if you guys are ever doing U-joints, make sure they're phased correctly, and that means that the so see how we can see the circle of that side of the U-joint there facing towards us, the closest one. On this side, that needs to be the same. So if you take a step back, those are both in the same plane on either side, and then that way you don't get binding. So that's important to note. All right, got the hubs on left and right, looking pretty good. Any Coot owners, if you ever wondered, it's just 6 bolts, and that's the entire assembly. You can pull that right off. I mean, you're gonna have to undo the bolt that I don't have in right now because I don't have clearance to put it in, and then you can slide this piece out and everything comes out together. Yeah, it's kind of nice. I just got to put the spacers on, and one step closer to being done. Of note, these castle nuts I bought, they're actually too short. I don't know what model came with the Coot, but these ones don't come up to the pin, so I'm gonna have to back another net onto them or do something, because obviously running a wire through that isn't gonna catch. And these are 7/8 fine thread, if anyone wants to know. These guys take like over 6 ounces of grease too. If you clean all the grease out of here, expect to be going forever and ever with the little grease gun. And you're going to want to stop once you get grease coming through your sails, and then you know there's grease in all the ball bearings. These are the spacers. I had mentioned them before. I don't know if I ever had video of them up close. They're made in China. They're just really cheap aluminum spacers. Actually really cheap. I think I mentioned them in a previous video how cheap these were. My father got them for almost nothing. But they're 2-inch spacers. They're as big as you can get spacers before they start getting expensive. And they allow you to run these much wider tires, because otherwise you're going to be rubbing into the tub. But these really help, and your turn radius isn't reduced. I prefer narrower machines, but with these big tires you really don't have a choice unless you want to remove all your steering capacity. If you are looking for wheel spacers, it's 5 by 4.5. That's the size you want. That is the Jeep rim. Chrysler usually uses that pattern for rims, for wheels, and what you want for a spacer. All right, one more torque transmitter box adjusted. So this is my father's Coot, the new Vanguard one. And you can see with this jig, you can actually install it without even removing the drive shaft, which is really handy for less work. There was so much thread exposed in this, I didn't even have to take the lock ring off. This one was really stiff to get off as well. In fact, I couldn't even do it with just the leverage of this guy. So the trick I used, and I suggest for anyone else that needs to, you just tap the edges of this device, because it's kind of like hitting the teeth on the ring there, because you know you get more leverage on the edges, and that freed it up. And now it's nice and tight. So I noticed that just like my machine, I was getting spinning of the shaft and of the worm gear without spinning of this bearing on backlash, meaning I'd rock the machine. Oh, wait a second. It's not doing it anymore because I've adjusted it, but I'd rock the machine and this would slowly start cogging the other direction along with the bearing. But once this is tightened up, the pressure between here, the worm gear, and this bearing face, you won't be able to turn this spacer anymore, and that's what you probably want. And then that way it forces this bearing to turn along with the shaft in there. Also of note, notice how thick these teeth are compared to the ones in my machine. That's just because my machine has like probably a bazillion hours on it, and because the rear torque transmitter box was out of whack for so long that they wear the teeth down. If there's slop in there, there'll be unnecessary friction, and the boxes will actually heat up. That machine, the box would get to like 120 degrees after about 2 hours of driving non-stop, according to a heat gun. And while, yeah, in theory, 120 degrees is not the end of the world for your oil and grease, that does mean there's friction coming from somewhere, and that's just from the fact that it was so sloppy. This one has clearly been in tune for most of its life because you still got those nice thick teeth and they have not been worn away. So that's all good news. Hopefully this box will last for many decades. While we're in here, we're going to want to grease these zerks. So on a Coot, this pivoting mechanism in the middle is actually a giant threaded pipe, as wild as that is. You've just got short segments of essentially threaded tube on either side welded to the tubs, and then this piece in the middle is just one very short section of large outer diameter threaded pipe. So when the Coot pivots in the middle, you're actually threading in and threading out of this giant pipe, which is a really weird way to do it. But obviously you're only threading by, you know, that tiny bit, like a quarter of a turn at most articulation. So in theory, you're actually like squeezing in and like pulling back out these two sections. Probably one reason they use like wood in case you need to compress a little bit. But of course, you've got thread on thread over and over. Every tiny little bump and rock you go over is a little bit of turning on those threads. So you always want to make sure you got grease in there. And they're hard to grease with the cover on, but once you have the cover off, you know, you can get in there. Yeah, this is weird. My Coot does not have a second ring of zerks. See that one in there? And they go all the way around. I don't know how that happens, because I thought one side was welded to the tub and the other side was free floating, because if they're both free floating, I would think, you know, eventually you might somehow manage to like work its way out over 100 years. Yeah, it's kind of strange, but anyways, yeah, so grease your zerks. There's red and tacky right now in the machine, but I'm switching over to marine grease. Usually that's what I'm using these days, because the water will seep in through these threads if there's not grease in there, and marine grease is probably better for water stuff. Well, she's out of the shed, rolling into her own power. Purring. I do like these Vanguard engines. She's out. All the wheels are on. All the new parts are in the back. Testing these steering stops I made. Really crude. They're just wood with glue behind them. They're not permanent, really. Well, we'll see how long they last. But I want to make sure that I don't rub the body. And I put some white out here, so if I rub it off, I know that I'm still touching the body when I turn. side. So, well, actually one broke off, so that's probably the reason. I'll have to come up with something more permanent. But yeah, I started broken on that side. But I'll figure it out. Wow, this is so much faster than mine.